Hey guys, so today we're going to do a very quick lesson and explanation of what the American Civil Rights Movement is. The reason we're looking at the American Civil Rights Movement is because it gives us good context for the film that we're studying, Remember the Titans. Remember the Titans takes place just towards the end of the American Civil Rights Movement, so it really gives us a good context and an insight into what the themes are in the movie and why there is so much racial tension in the movie. So first of all, we'll look at what is the American Civil Rights Movement. So the African American Civil Rights Movement took place in the USA from around the 50s to the 70s. It was a period of great change. A lot of change took place within this time between the 50s and the 70s. This change aimed to stop racial discrimination and racism aimed at African Americans. Since African people arrived in the United States of America, they have faced large amounts of discrimination. They originally arrived as slaves, used in the South on cotton farms, so they have faced a lot of discrimination. Even after slavery was banned, they were often treated as second-class citizens. So it was a movement to try and stop the racism that African Americans faced in the United States. So how were African Americans treated? I said before that they were treated unfairly and as second-class citizens, so we'll have a brief look at how they were treated and what sparks the civil rights movement. Why do the African American people want change? So in the South of America, of the USA, African Americans lived under what was known as Jim Crow laws. Many people always ask me, what does Jim Crow mean? To be honest, I'm not sure, but the laws were Jim Crow laws. Okay, so this is the sort of laws that the African Americans lived under. The Jim Crow laws were anti-African American laws that meant African American people were treated like second-class citizens. Okay, they didn't have the same rights that white citizens had. Okay, you may have seen pictures like this before, and it's an example of Jim Crow. So, for example, the white citizens would use the sink on the left, the bubbler on the left, whereas the African Americans had to use the one on the right. And it obviously wasn't restricted to drinking fountains, it was to all aspects of life. Often the services that the African Americans were allowed to use were not as good, and often they weren't allowed the same access to rights and to services that white people were. So some of the laws from the Jim Crow include things like it was illegal for white people and African American people to be served food in the same room. Okay, so for example, in restaurants in places like Alabama, which is in the South, African Americans would have to go into the back of the restaurant to receive their food, whereas the white customers could sit out the front. Marriage between a white person and an African American person is prohibited. So an African American person obviously wasn't allowed to marry a white person and vice versa. The school for white people and the schools for African American children must be separate. So they weren't allowed to go to the same schools, and often white schools were the ones that were funded more, given more money, had more access to books and things like that. Public facilities such as waiting rooms, buses or drinking fountains are to be separate. And often on buses, for example, there were certain areas where African Americans had to sit and things like that. So what was the punishment for breaking Jim Crow laws? Okay, so they were very, very severe. So the punishment for breaking the Jim Crow laws were often very extreme for African Americans. Often people were lynched, and now that's a form of public hanging, okay? And they were often beaten or tortured or arrested or treated very badly if they broke the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws extended throughout a lot of social life. It wasn't simply buses and things like that. It was through all of a whole area of social life. For example, African Americans weren't allowed to use white Americans' first names. They had to use their last names as a form of some sort of respect, I suppose. So the image I'm about to bring up may be upsetting to some of you. So if you don't want to see it, please look away. It is an image of a lynching that took place in the south of America. So please, if you don't want to see it, look away now and I'll flick on. So as you can see, very violent and very distressing. So we're just going to look very briefly now at some of the key players in the civil rights movement. Who were the important people? So Martin Luther King Jr., you may have heard of, was a very, very important person in the American civil rights movement. And he was one of the main people who really fought for African American civil rights. So there were many important people who fought for African American civil rights and fought for equality. But the most famous and the person we know most about is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister from Georgia in the South of America. And from the early age, he and his family suffered under the Jim Crow laws. And there's a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was influential in organising civil rights protests, mostly through non-violent resistance. That was something that Martin Luther King Jr. was very strong on. He felt that non-violence was the best way to go about achieving the goals. So these sorts of non-violent protests included the Montgomery bus boycotts, where African Americans refused to use the buses after Rosa Parks was told that she had to give up her seat to a white person. So they refused to use the buses. The March on Washington, where thousands and thousands of people marched to Washington and protested for civil rights, and the Birmingham campaign, where again there was a lot of protests and things like that. Very sadly, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th in 1968 by James Earl Ray. And here's some examples, just pictures of non-violent resistance. So you can see the protesters being hit with a high-pressure hose, and you can see Martin Luther King Jr. in the middle there protesting with other civil rights activists. Another example of the civil rights movement happened in a little town called Little Rock. And it's a little bit similar to the movie that we're watching. It's a little bit similar to Remember the Titans, where, however, this was the first case of African American students coming to a white school. And it's a really interesting story, and it shows just how I suppose, intense it was for African American students at the time. And it's similar to what we see in the movie. So one of the most important moments in the civil rights movement happened in a little town called Little Rock in Arkansas. Okay, there's the Little Rock 9 there. After the US court said that segregation, so segregation is the separation of African Americans and white Americans, which we talked about earlier, how they had to be separate on buses and all those sorts of things. So once they decided, the US courts decided that segregation of schools was illegal in 1957, a small town decided to begin allowing African American students to go to their white high school. And so they were the Little Rock 9, and they were the students who were chosen to what they call desegregate, so allow African Americans to go to the school. On their first day at school, the Little Rock 9 faced large protests from people who didn't want African American students in a white school, and the governor, the person in charge of the state of Arkansas, who was also against joining the schools together, he put armed guards at the doors to stop people from entering the school. And you can see there's one of the people, one of the students, the Little Rock 9, who are much older than you, trying to go to school in the morning, and you can see there's a large crowd of people following them. So if you could just imagine going to school and having not only people yelling at you, telling you they don't want you there, threatening you physically, threatening you with violence, but also having armed guards stop you from entering the school ground. Must have been terribly frightening for them, and it was, a different time in history. So at the stage when the governor of Arkansas wouldn't let the students in, the President of the United States actually sent the army to protect the students and allow them access to the school. So you're trying to go to school, the armed guards stop you, and then you get an army escort to school. So even though the students were eventually allowed access to the school, they were treated very poorly by fellow students, and they required their army guards to be with them during school. So there you can see They're Little Rock Nine surrounded by the army going into school. So very intense for those students, and there was a lot of hatred towards those students. Here there's a couple of clips on the Little Rock Nine that I'd like you to watch. I'll post those just below this video.